The day of King Joffrey Baratheon's wedding dawned bright and clear in King's Landing. The sky a pristine blue canvas that seemed almost at odds with the tension thrumming beneath the surface of all who attended. From the balconies high above the city streets, lords and ladies in their finery gazed upon the throngs below, waiting to see the spectacle of a royal celebration. Silk banners embroidered with golden lions and crowned stags draped every stone wall, fluttering in a soft breeze that carried the scents of honey cakes, roast meats, and the salt of the Blackwater Bay. Servants rushed about, polishing the floors of the Great September, adjusting floral arrangements, and ensuring that every detail shone with regal splendor. Joffrey himself was in rare form, smiling one moment, barking orders the next. He wore crimson silk, bright as freshly spilled blood, and a cloak edged in gold lace. Even to the casual observer, there was something about him that day, a poisonous arrogance that clung to him like a second skin. Margaery Tyrell stood at his side, resplendent in her gown and the fragrance of roses. Her face was the portrait of poise, but those with keen eyes noticed the faint tension in the set of her jaw. Theirs was a union forged of politics and power, meant to ensure the Tyrells' loyalty to the Iron Throne and to tie Highgarden's wealth to the Lannisters' cause. The ceremony proceeded with due pomp, the bells of the city ringing out in a joyous cacophony. As the day wore on, courtiers and commoners alike drifted to the lavish feast outside the Red Keep, where laughter mingled with music and the sweet perfume of boar roasting on the spit. In another timeline, Queen of Thorns Olenna Tyrell would have slipped a deadly poison into King Joffrey's cup, stealing his life at the pinnacle of celebration and sparing the realm from his cruelty. But in this world, that subtle pinch of poison never found its way into Joffrey's wine. There were fleeting moments that day when Olenna seemed poised to do something. She whispered to Margaery, her wrinkled hands light on her granddaughter's arm, and her eyes flickered toward Joffrey's goblet. Perhaps she was weighing whether it would be worth it, ending his life before he could inflict more misery upon the realm. But in the final moments, her courage, or perhaps her cunning, faltered. She saw the unsmiling faces of the gold cloaks, the watchful eyes of Cersei Lannister, and the notion of House Tyrell's future compromised by suspicion. She withdrew her hand from Margaery's sleeve and said nothing, leaving the realm to its fate. The feast continued unimpeded. Jugglers, fools, and singers performed for the king's amusement. The dwarf Justers still arrived, reenacting the War of the Five Kings in mocking pantomime. Joffrey laughed himself breathless at the spectacle, and Tyrion Lannister watched from the sidelines, his face fixed in a polite mask that failed to hide a flicker of disgust. Sansa Stark, seated beside Tyrion, kept her head bowed, her auburn hair veiling her expression. She said little, mind adrift with thoughts of her murdered family and the precariousness of her position. Joffrey, growing ever more emboldened by laughter and wine, entertained himself by calling for more amusements. He ordered his uncle Tyrion to serve as his cupbearer, humiliating him in front of the entire court. He made Margaery dance for him twice, each time more elaborate and more taxing, while the crowd clapped with forced smiles. But, importantly, the day ended without a single drop of poison. King Joffrey Baratheon did not choke, nor did he fall. He lived to sit upon the Iron Throne, and from that day forward, the realm would learn just how dire a mistake it was that no one intervened to stop his tyranny. The morning after the wedding, a hush seemed to fall upon King's Landing as if the city itself sensed the shift in the wind. Where once rumors had circulated that Joffrey might not last long, given the enemies he had made, those whispers quieted. He was king, and he was securely on the throne, backed by House Lannister and House Tyrell. Yet, under the surface, anxiety permeated every corridor. The lords and ladies who had hoped for an abrupt end to his rule found their calculations in disarray. Grand Maester Pycelle shuffled about, fussing over the wedding feast's aftermath, while Varys slipped through the shadows, collecting whispers. None dared say aloud what they all knew. They had missed their chance, and now they had to live with the consequences. At the small council meeting convened 2 days after the wedding, Joffrey presided over the table in his new finery, still basking in the afterglow of his wedding triumph. Cersei, seated to his right, kept a vigilant eye on those assembled, her brother Tyrion, Lord Mace Tyrell, Prince Oberyn Martell, and others who had business in the capital. Margaery, newly anointed as queen, sat quietly, watching her husband with careful eyes. The conversation touched upon the crown's debts, the lingering war in the Riverlands, and negotiations with Dorne. Joffrey's contributions were sporadic outbursts rather than reasoned input. At one point, he sneered at Tyrion's recommendation to rebuild certain villages ravaged by the war, calling it a waste of coin better spent on the royal fleet. No one contradicted him too bluntly, for they all recalled how swiftly he could turn to cruelty. His suggestion, to forcibly tax the poorer regions that had shown reluctance or inability to pay, and to send the gold cloaks to enforce these new levies, sent a ripple of unease around the table. Even Mace Tyrell, who had come to King's Landing to see his daughter wed to a great king, appeared unsettled by the notion of punishing peasants who were already destitute from the war. But he said nothing. Joffrey, emboldened, took silence as agreement. By the meeting's end, a new decree was drawn up, ensuring that lords and small folk alike would feel the tightening grip of the crown's greed. From that day, King Joffrey's rule began to bear fruit. He ordered a grand statue of himself erected in the Red Keep's courtyard to commemorate his marriage. "And my brilliant leadership in the War of the Five Kings," he added. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, and artists were pulled from across the realm to render the king in marble and gold. Funds that could have gone to the city's infrastructure or the war-weary farmland were redirected toward this project. Cersei, quietly exultant in her son's growing renown, gave him whatever he asked for. Margaery, holding her counsel, attempted at times to redirect his attentions toward charities for orphans or improvements to the city's bread distribution, but these suggestions met with only mild interest if they did not promise public adulation of the king. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen heard rumors of a cruel boy king reigning in Westeros, though the details were murky. She was embroiled in her own battles, liberating cities along Slaver's Bay. Her attention was far from the Iron Throne for the moment, and thus she paid no mind to the tales of Joffrey's tyranny. In the north, the bastard Jon Snow fought to keep the Night's Watch together against the threats beyond the Wall. He had no illusions that King's Landing would send him any aid. From what he understood of Joffrey's nature, the dire warnings he'd sent south might very well be ignored. Thus, the realm's business carried on in uneasy tolerance of a boy king growing into a cruel young man. Sansa Stark found her days increasingly fraught. Freed from Joffrey's betrothal by Margaery's arrival, she had dared to hope that perhaps her life would be less perilous. But Joffrey still took perverse pleasure in tormenting her when they crossed paths in the halls. She was still wed to Tyrion, whose initial attempts to shield her from harm often came to naught when faced with Joffrey's whim. The more the new king discovered that Sansa sparked pity in others, the more he delighted in humiliating her. Yet it was a quieter torment than before. Joffrey was no longer fixated on making her his bride. Now she was merely a convenient target for any frustrations he felt. If the peasants in Flea Bottom rioted, it was Sansa's blank face that drew his ire. If Margaery refused him something, he might recall some perceived slight from Sansa and visit that anger upon her or Tyrion. Tyrion worked hard to maintain a facade of civility, outwardly paying homage to his nephew. But behind closed doors, he and Varys began to discuss possibilities. Smuggling Sansa out of the city, for instance, or forging alliances that might dethrone Joffrey. The problem was that Joffrey's position was no longer precarious. The Tyrells had married into him, Tywin Lannister's gold and formidable cunning still supported him, and the unified Lannister forces had crushed most major opposition. Robb Stark was dead, betrayed at the Red Wedding. Stannis Baratheon had retreated to Dragonstone, licking his wounds, while the Iron Islands were consumed by their own ambitions. Tyrion found no easy solutions, and as time passed, it appeared that King Joffrey would strengthen his hold on Westeros rather than lose it. One afternoon, well into the new marriage, Joffrey strolled through the royal gardens with Margaery, accompanied by a small retinue of guards and ladies in waiting. The queen attempted to charm her husband, speaking of the upcoming harvest festival, suggesting that if they extended an olive branch to the small folk by attending the festivities, the people might grow fonder of the royal couple. Joffrey, half listening, swatted at the air with a golden-handled riding crop. He had little patience for talk of peasants. Even so, he liked the idea of being adored. Marjorie's talent lay in that very field, making the masses love her. Her skill at charity, her grace, and her ability to soften Joffrey's image in the public had already made her beloved among the commoners, if not as fervently as she had been in Highgarden. But Joffrey, as always, could not abide a sense of being overshadowed. He demanded a new kind of festival, one in which tribute would be given specifically to the king, not the queen. He wanted singing of his glory, tournaments in his name, lavish feasts that depicted scenes of his might. Marjorie, maintaining her sweet smile, agreed wholeheartedly, thinking perhaps this concession would soothe his pride. If King Joffrey felt adored, maybe he would be less inclined to cruelty. She was half right. For a brief span of days, Joffrey seemed content, strutting about the Red Keep, giving orders for how the festival should proceed. Singers were commissioned, gold poured into the creation of extravagant floats, and small folk from all over the Crownlands were called to attend, whether they wished to or not. Yet with every indulgence, the crown sank deeper into debt. The Iron Bank of Bravos had begun to send polite queries about payments. Lord Tywin, unamused by his grandson's profligacy, tried to intervene, reminding Joffrey that a true king balanced might with financial prudence. Joffrey bristled at the reminder that he owed anything to his grandfather. A rift began to grow between the two, unspoken but potent. Cersei, seeing the tension, tried to soothe Tywin, promising him that her son was merely testing the waters of kingship. But Tywin was too canny a statesman to be fooled. The realm was being poorly managed, and if they did not rein Joffrey in, he feared a rebellion might erupt. The small folk were not infinitely pliable. Between new taxes, forced conscriptions, and the high cost of food, there was only so much they could bear. On the night before the festival's grand opening, a hush lay over the city. The tension in the air was so thick that those sensitive to it felt gooseflesh prickle their arms. Flickers of torchlight lit the streets around the Red Keep, and patrols of gold cloaks marched up and down, ensuring curfew was observed. In her chambers, Marjorie Tyrell sat alone, brushing her long hair and pondering her situation. She had once believed she might tame Joffrey, at least somewhat, or guide him toward being a more just ruler. But in the weeks following their wedding, she had witnessed his descent into a cruelty that bordered on the sadistic. He threatened servants over the slightest error. He took pleasure in creating competitions that set small folk against each other for meager rewards. Now, with this festival meant to glorify him, Marjorie understood she was not dealing with a boy who could be guided, but a young man who reveled in his capacity for fear. The next day, the festival began, replete with color and sound. Minstrels sang praises of King Joffrey, their lyrics full of hyperbole. Great pavilions were erected in the fields outside the city walls for jousting, archery contests, and other demonstrations of martial prowess. Joffrey presided over it all from a raised dais, wearing a glittering crown of rubies and gold. Marjorie sat by his side, her face an expert mask of radiant delight. At times, the king would lean over to offer some cruel jest in her ear, but she only smiled, hand resting lightly on his arm. In truth, many knights and lords felt uneasy competing under the gaze of a king who might punish them for winning, or losing incorrectly. Some chose to lose on purpose, uncertain of Joffrey's mood. Others sought to win everything, hoping to flatter the king with their skill. In the end, the contests lacked genuine valor. Everything was tainted by the presence of a watchful, malevolent monarch. Yet the crowd, at least superficially, cheered. Bread and honeyed wine were distributed, dancers in bright silks performed, and illusions of joy abounded. Behind that thin veneer, misgivings festered like an infected wound. That evening, Joffrey demanded entertainment in the Great Hall. He had heard that a new group of acrobats had arrived from Pentos, so he insisted they perform. The acrobats, fearing that any slip might mean their heads, put on a dazzling display. But as the night wore on, Joffrey's wine intake grew, and so did his boredom. He called for other forms of amusement, Dwarfs, fools, singers, any novelty that might catch his attention. When it was suggested to him that the hour grew late, he flew into a rage. He nearly upended the table before Margaery calmed him with coaxing words, promising that the festivities would continue as long as he wished. The acrobats fled, replaced by dancers. Tyrion and Sansa, forced to watch from the sidelines, exchanged grim glances. The court was a captive audience to a king's whims, and none could protest. Amid this celebration, a group of commoners gathered in Flea Bottom. Tired of the taxes, hungry from the high prices of bread and stew, they whispered about rebellion. A blacksmith's apprentice with a fiery temper argued that no king had the right to bleed the people dry. Another, a washerwoman whose husband had died in the war, swore that the new taxes would mean she'd lose her home. These small gatherings dotted the labyrinthine alleys of King's Landing. But the gold cloaks, loyal to Joffrey so long as they were paid, showed no mercy when they got wind of it. By midnight, any rumored rebel or outspoken critic found themselves in a dungeon cell or floating face down in Blackwater Bay. Word of this purging leaked out, fueling more fear among the people. The festival above might shine with gaiety, but beneath it, terror kept the city in check. A week later, the Great Hall of the Red Keep was the site of a grim spectacle, a trial. Dozens of alleged traitors, peasants mostly, stood chained, awaiting Joffrey's pleasure. He demanded confessions of treason against the crown. Most were too terrified to deny it. Joffrey's twisted grin spread across his face as he accused them of plotting to remove him from the throne. One by one, they stammered admissions, hoping that maybe a confession would spare them. It did not. At the end of the trial, Joffrey commanded that the heads of the ringleaders be mounted on spikes along the city walls. Families wailed for mercy, but none came. Margaery, seated to the side, could barely hide her horror. Tyrion quietly intervened where he could, sometimes pleading a pregnant woman's belly or a sickly child, hoping that might stay Joffrey's hand. Occasionally, the boy king would indulge a show of mercy, granting a lesser punishment like a flogging instead of execution. But these were small concessions in a tide of brutality. That evening, in the privacy of her chambers, Margaery confronted her grandmother. Olenna Tyrell had grown increasingly distressed by Joffrey's mercurial ruthlessness. Margaery demanded to know why Olenna had hinted she might end Joffrey before the wedding but had not gone through with it. Olenna looked at her granddaughter with sorrow etched into her wrinkles. She confessed that she had planned it, but the risk had seemed too great at the last moment. She feared the blame would fall on House Tyrell, destroying their legacy and plunging the Reach into ruin. Margaery's eyes brimmed with tears of frustration. She pointed out that now they were living under the rule of a monster. Olenna, her heart aching, could only nod. She promised Margaery that she would find a way, that something could still be done. But deep down, Olenna knew every day Joffrey lived tightened his grip on the throne. News of Joffrey's actions spread, carried by bards, traveling merchants, and whispers in the night. In the Vale, Peter Baelish smirked upon hearing of the Boy King's escalating brutality. For Littlefinger, chaos was opportunity. He made quiet overtures to certain lords disillusioned with King Joffrey's reign, sowing seeds of doubt and forging new alliances. He kept his true intentions hidden, feigning loyalty to the crown while nurturing the possibility that he might step into the vacuum if the kingdom tore itself apart. In the Riverlands, Walder Frey licked his lips, content that his position was secure after the Red Wedding. Yet he, too, began to question whether Joffrey's tyranny would eventually set the entire realm aflame, and whether he might need to hedge his bets. Across the sea in Braavos, the Iron Bank took note of the crown's extravagant spending. The Lannisters might still be wealthy, but not infinitely so. Rumors that Tywin Lannister was aging and that Joffrey was growing out of control prompted the bank's representatives to consider alternative investments, Stannis Baratheon among them. If King Joffrey continued to displease the realm, the Iron Bank might shift its support, leading to a conflict that would once more fracture the Seven Kingdoms. A significant turning point arrived in the form of a small skirmish in the Stormlands. A group of lords, outraged by Joffrey's demands for tribute and fed up with the pillaging that accompanied the royal tax collectors, decided to resist. They raised their banners in defiance, expecting other houses to join them. However, the reach of the Lannister and Tyrell alliance was vast. The revolt was quickly crushed by a combined force of Crownlanders and Tyrell men-at-arms, led by Randyll Tarly, who had a fearsome reputation as a battle commander. The rebellious lords were taken captive and brought to King's Landing in chains. Joffrey, eager to make a public spectacle, announced that they would be tried for high treason in the Dragon Pit, a ruin that would serve as a dramatic stage for the punishment of those who challenged his throne. On the appointed day, thousands of spectators were herded to the Dragon Pit. The vast structure, crumbling in places, gave the event a haunting quality. Joffrey presided from a tall wooden platform, clad in a red doublet embroidered with roaring lions, wearing his heavy crown. Margaery sat near him, her fae, Aturs schooled into neutrality. The lords, broken and bruised from their defeat, were forced to kneel on the cracked floor. Some pleaded for mercy, others maintained a stoic silence. Joffrey proclaimed that they were guilty of betraying not just him, but the realm itself. When Tyrion quietly reminded him that mercy might be more prudent than mass execution, Joffrey snapped, "You have grown too bold for your stature, imp." He refused to be swayed. The sentencing was harsh. All those found guilty of treason would die, their lands forfeit to the crown or given to loyal vassals. The crowd watched as heads rolled, blood staining the ancient stones. The gold cloaks forced onlookers to remain until every sentence was carried out. Mothers covered children's eyes. Men who had once cheered Joffrey's victories now found themselves sickened. If there had been any doubt about the king's brutality, it was dispelled that day. Margaery, tears in her eyes, retreated to the Red Keep as soon as she could, claiming illness. Olenna Tyrell stared across the sea of terrified faces and realized that Joffrey had pushed the realm to a breaking point. The question was whether the break would come in open rebellion or a slow, smoldering collapse. Day by day, Joffrey's untempered appetites grew. He found new ways to torment those who displeased him or simply drew his attention. He belittled his council, threatened his allies, and demanded constant praise. The only person who could occasionally moderate his excesses was Tywin Lannister. Whenever his grandfather appeared, Joffrey would attempt a show of bravado, but Tywin's imperious glare and sharp words could still quell him briefly. In turn, Joffrey began to loathe Tywin, seeing in him the one force that kept him from total liberty. And so the seeds of resentment were planted in Joffrey's heart, and he nurtured them in secret. A new threat to Joffrey's reign emerged from the shadows. Information brokered by Varys, the master of whisperers. He had begun to spread quiet rumors that Joffrey's cruelty was destabilizing the realm, encouraging certain key figures to imagine a future without him. He was careful, never stating outright that he himself was disloyal, but sowing the ground for a possible coup. Tyrion, too, found himself drowning in regrets. He wished he had done more to protect Sansa, to mitigate Joffrey's malice, or to align with those who might end his nephew's reign. But each time he considered an overt act, he remembered that the Lannister power base had no equal. If he tried to orchestrate Joffrey's downfall and failed, it would mean death for him, Sansa, and anyone else connected to the plot. As the year drew on, the small folk across Westeros suffered under increased taxation. The land ravaged by war had little to give. Famine loomed in some regions, and the added burden of Joffrey's demands threatened even the more fertile territories. Highgarden continued to supply grain to King's Landing, but the arrangement was extortionate. The Tyrells had to provide food to the capital or risk Joffrey's wrath. But in doing so, they strained their own resources, and the cost was borne by their vassals, who now questioned whether House Tyrell's close ties to the crown were truly beneficial. Margaery redoubled her philanthropic efforts, making sure orphans were clothed, feeding the poor in the city squares, and hosting events that at least gave the illusion of generosity from the throne. Joffrey tolerated this only because it made him look good to a segment of the population. But the moment Margaery's compassion threatened to overshadow his power, he became petulant, accusing her of trying to steal his glory. To appease him, Marjorie played her part carefully, always giving him the credit. Sometimes, she considered running away altogether, but she knew her family would suffer for it. She was, in every sense, trapped. In the north, House Bolton had been rewarded for its treachery against the Starks. Roose Bolton was Warden of the North, and his bastard son Ramsay found in Joffrey's brutality a model to aspire to. Their hold on Winterfell remained tenuous, though, given the hostility of the Northern Lords. They had no love for the Boltons or for the Boy King in King's Landing. The region simmered with hidden resentments. A new war might spark if only the Northern Lords believed there was a chance of victory. For now, they waited, enduring the false peace. Beyond the wall, the threat of the White Walkers grew. Jon Snow and the Night's Watch did what they could to shore up defenses, forging alliances with the wildlings under Tormund Giantsbane now that Mance Rayder was gone. Ravens flew south bearing warnings, but under Joffrey's rule, those warnings were ignored. Fairy tales and nightmares, the king scoffed. Let them freeze in the snow. Only a few within the capital took the messages seriously, mainly Tyrion and those with the imagination to fear the old stories. But Tyrion had no real authority to mobilize any significant defense for the north. The resources he might have commanded were controlled by Joffrey and Tywin. Thus, the kingdom's eyes remained fixated on internal strife while an ancient menace gathered in the far north. Small pockets of resistance began to sprout. A minor rebellion in the Reach was quashed by Mace Tyrell's men. A riot in the streets of King's Landing was stamped out by the Gold Cloaks with brutal efficiency. Yet these events grew more frequent, a sign of the roiling discontent that permeated the realm. King Joffrey responded with more cruelty, not less, believing that fear was the only way to keep people in line. He arranged for public executions of troublemakers, almost weekly now, turning them into spectacles. The Great September of Baelor was forced to hold mandatory services, extolling the virtues of loyalty to the crown, with High Septon squirming under the knowledge that he was complicit in Joffrey's tyranny. Inside the Red Keep, life remained a precarious dance. Marjorie did her best to broker small mercies. She petitioned Joffrey to release a few prisoners for every festival or holiday, which he sometimes did if it amused him or earned him praise. Cersei hovered near her son, thoroughly enjoying that the realm cowered before him, though a corner of her motherly anxiety feared he was going too far. Tywin tried to hold the kingdom together with a firm hand, but each passing day, he felt his influence slipping. Joffrey was no longer a child. He was a king who believed he had conquered all obstacles, and whose arrogance knew no limit. One evening, Olenna Tyrell paid a secret visit to Tyrion Lannister's chambers. She arrived heavily cloaked, escorted by one trusted guard. Tyrion, surprised, bid her enter. Once inside, Olenna discarded her hood. She admitted that she had once planned to kill Joffrey at the wedding but had lost her nerve. She confessed her regret. The realm was bleeding because she had acted too cautiously. Tyrion regarded her with a mix of bitterness and sympathy. He asked why she had come now. She replied that the time had come for a second chance, that Joffrey needed to be removed, not just for the Tyrell's sake but for everyone's. Tyrion, swirling wine in his cup, asked how they could possibly hope to succeed where before they had failed. Olenna explained that tensions were high, that Joffrey had alienated many powerful people, some within House Tyrell, some even within House Lannister itself. If they gathered enough allies, one strike at the king might succeed. But Tyrion knew the risk. King's Landing was packed with guards loyal to Joffrey. House Tyrell's men might turn if Marjorie was threatened, but an open coup would plunge the city into chaos. He also reminded Olenna that Tywin would not stand idly by. For all his frustrations with Joffrey, Tywin would never abide the murder of the crown's rightful king, his grandson, unless he believed the realm would benefit more from another occupant of the throne. Olenna nodded. That, she said, was where cunning might come into play. If it could be arranged to appear as though Joffrey fell in battle, or to an assassin from a foreign power, Tywin might accept it. Tyrion stared at the old woman, thinking of the lines newly etched in Sansa's face, or the outrages he had witnessed. He found himself slowly, warily agreeing. Yes, Joffrey must be stopped. But how? Word of this clandestine meeting spread, albeit faintly. Varys had his little birds everywhere, though for now, he kept the information close, weighing how best to use it. Littlefinger also watched from afar, monitoring the shifting alliances, guessing that soon a great game of intrigue would begin. The city was a tinderbox, and one spark could set it aflame. Joffrey himself continued on, blissfully unaware of the plot coalescing beneath his feet, so certain he was unassailable. Around this time, a new development rocked the capital. Word arrived that Stannis Baratheon had made a pact with the Iron Bank of Bravos. Ships bearing the flaming heart of the Lord of Light began to gather off the coast of Dragonstone. Stannis had not forgiven or forgotten his defeat at the Battle of the Blackwater. Now, with Braavosi Gold and the cunning Red Priestess Melisandre at his side, he prepared for another strike at the crown. Joffrey laughed when he heard the news. He believed that if Stannis had been beaten once, he could be beaten again. Tywin, on the other hand, took the threat seriously. He ordered new fortifications for King's Landing, demanded more men-at-arms from the crown's vassals, and began to stockpile wildfire once again. Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen advanced her campaign in Meereen. She had freed thousands of slaves, and whispers of her dragons reached King's Landing. Joffrey dismissed such tales as lies, or at most trifling amusements in a faraway land. He had no vision to understand that the Targaryen queen might eventually become a serious contender for the throne. But Varys and Tyrion, privately, kept a watchful eye on her progress. If the realm collapsed under Joffrey's tyranny, a Targaryen restoration might find ample support among the noble houses. In short, the stage was set for a grand confrontation. Stannis in the east, Daenerys in the distant lands beyond the Narrow Sea, the Tyrells and a contingent of Lannisters quietly plotting from within, and the small folk ready to explode in rebellion at the smallest hope of success. One gray morning, as clouds gathered over King's Landing, a messenger arrived from Riverrun. The remnants of House Tully, bolstered by bannermen loyal to the late Robb Stark, were rumored to be coordinating a resurgence. Jaime Lannister, having returned from the north with a golden hand in place of the one he lost, pleaded with his father to consider diplomacy. Jaime was no friend to rebellious lords, but he had seen enough bloodshed. He also found his own distaste for Joffrey growing. Despite Cersei's pleas, Jaime had come to realize that his son, though never acknowledged as such, was a menace. Tywin, however, dismissed Jaime's talk of diplomacy. The crown, he insisted, must respond to any rebellious stirrings with force. That same day, Sansa Stark made a daring choice. She slipped away from her guards while walking in the gardens. With the aid of Dantos Hollard, the fool who had once promised her an escape at her wedding, and who still lingered in the shadows of the court, she managed to flee the Red Keep. Whether Tyrion had a hand in this or not remained a mystery. Sansa's disappearance caused a minor uproar among the castle guards. Joffrey flew into a rage when he heard she was gone, suspecting anyone and everyone of treachery. He accused Tyrion, who denied it. He accused Margaery, who denied it. He even ranted at his mother, who tried to calm him. But Sansa was beyond the city walls before the search truly began. She vanished into the night, her fate unknown. For Joffrey, this was a mortal insult. He had never forgiven Sansa for being a Stark, cousin to traitors, he called her. Now she had evaded him, slipping away like a frightened bird from a cage. Enraged, he ordered the gold cloaks to scour the city, punishing anyone suspected of helping her. He proclaimed a bounty on her head, alive or dead. Tyrion watched, helpless to intervene. Margaery heard and wept, knowing what fate would befall Sansa if she were caught. Cersei quietly seethed that the little wolf girl had slipped their grasp. The city clamped down even tighter under martial law, the atmosphere as tense as a wound pulled taut. In the midst of this chaos, Olenna Tyrell, feeling the time was ripe, reached out to those she believed could be trusted. She enlisted Margaery to whisper to certain knights who loathed Joffrey for his humiliations, to rally them to a just cause. She made inroads with Tyrion again, though he remained cautious. She even found a secret ally in the shadows. Bronn, Tyrion's former cellsword, whose allegiance could be bought, but whose cunning was formidable. Their plan coalesced around the notion that Joffrey had become too unstable, too dangerous to the realm. They would do what they once had the opportunity to do discreetly at the wedding, but had failed. Alas, the best-laid plans often go awry. Joffrey, suspicious by nature, had begun to suspect the Tyrells of plotting against him. He noticed the subtle glances, the murmured conversations. He saw how even Margaery seemed distant of late, how she rarely smiled at him. He began to station his own spies within their retinue. One night, a young serving girl overheard Olenna and Margaery discussing the realm's fate if Joffrey continued to rule. The girl fled to inform one of Joffrey's watchers. Soon, a quiet investigation was launched. Joffrey, for once, showed restraint, not publicly exposing what he learned. Instead, he resolved to catch them all in the act, so that no one could doubt their guilt. Soon enough, an opportunity arose. The Queen's Ball, a grand celebration in the Red Keep, nominally in honor of Margaery, but in truth another excuse for Joffrey to parade his power. Feasts were laid out, music filled the halls, and the entire court was expected to attend. Olenna and Margaery had been planning to use the event as cover for their attempt. It would be a reenactment of the wedding plan. Slip poison into Joffrey's wine when no one was looking, make it look like a sudden illness, and hope that in the ensuing confusion they could pin the blame elsewhere, perhaps on one of the lesser lords who had ties to Stannis or on a foreign dignitary. It was risky, but the time for half measures had long passed. That night, the great hall glittered with candlelight. Courtiers in bright silks and polished armor mingled, exchanging hollow pleasantries. Musicians played lively tunes to distract from the palpable tension. Tyrion wore a resigned expression, nursing his wine. Varys drifted about like a shadow. Cersei, regal in a crimson gown, hovered near Joffrey, who held court in the center of the hall. Margaery appeared stunning in green and gold, a floral wreath in her hair, a rose queen for the evening. Olenna, draped in her customary high-collared attire, moved through the crowd with slow dignity. The stage was set. When Joffrey lifted his goblet to receive more wine from a servant, Olenna discreetly reached out. Her hand brushed against the stem for the briefest second, slipping something unseen into the cup, or so she thought. She returned to her seat, heart pounding in her ancient chest, sure that no one had noticed. Margaery glanced at her grandmother from across the room, giving the subtlest nod of understanding. The next moment stretched into an eternity as Joffrey raised the goblet to his lips. But he did not drink. Instead, he lowered the cup and looked directly at Olenna Tyrell, a mocking smile twisting his features. "Grandmother," he said, voice dripping with false affection, "why don't you try this first? A toast to your lovely granddaughter, and to the future of the realm." The hall fell silent. Olenna froze. She knew at that moment that she had been discovered. Gasps rose from the assembled courtiers as Joffrey walked toward Olenna, goblet extended. 2 gold cloaks appeared, seizing the elderly woman by her arms, forcing her to her knees. Margaery let out a cry, rushing forward, but more guards blocked her path. Cersei looked on, her expression a mask of triumph mixed with shock at her son's theatrics. Tyrion, eyes wide, realized that the game was up. The hush grew deafening as Joffrey circled Olenna, tipping the goblet's rim so close to her lips that the old woman had to turn her face away. He roared at the crowd, "Behold the traitors in our midst! The Tyrells seek to poison their rightful king. This is high treason." A stunned moment passed, broken only by Margaery's frantic pleas. Olenna tried to speak, to protest her innocence, but Joffrey struck her across the face with his gloved hand. The force of the blow snapped her head back, and she groaned in pain. Margaery's voice echoed through the hall. "Husband, please. She's an old woman. Let her speak." But Joffrey was beyond reason. He raged, brandishing the goblet. He commanded a guard to seize Margaery as well. The queen was pulled away, her wrists clasped behind her back. The entire court watched, paralyzed. Then Joffrey's gaze settled on Mace Tyrell, who was being held at sword point by several gold cloaks. "All of you are traitors," Joffrey thundered. "You and your wretched brood sought to murder me. Did you think I wouldn't see your treachery? I am the king. I see everything." In that instant, chaos erupted. Knights loyal to the Tyrells tried to defend their lords, but the gold cloaks and King's Guard quickly overpowered them. Lannister men-at-arms appeared from hidden positions. Screams reverberated off the walls. Cersei, standing behind Joffrey, exhaled sharply, unsure if even she could stop her son now. Tyrion, seeing the carnage about to unfold, tried to intervene, but was knocked aside. Olenna Tyrell, trembling with rage and fear, locked eyes with Margaery, her mouth forming words that were lost in the uproar. Joffrey commanded that Olenna be made an example of. The old woman was dragged to the front of the dais, where so many had met their end before. Margaery broke free from the guard restraining her, screaming for mercy. She reached for Joffrey, tears streaming down her face. "My king, my husband, please, if you show mercy, we can sort this out." This was all a misunderstanding. Joffrey's lip curled in a sneer. He hurled the goblet to the floor, the wine sloshing across the tiles. "Misunderstanding? Do you think I'm a fool?" He snatched a sword from a nearby guard and drove it through Olenna's chest without ceremony. The Queen of Thorns crumpled, her eyes still wide with fury as the life drained from her. Margaery's scream shook the hall, echoed by gasps of horror. Blood pooled beneath Olenna's body, a crimson flower on the cold stone floor. With that single act, Joffrey severed the fragile alliance between the crown and House Tyrell. The great hall descended into pandemonium. Tyrell knights attempted to fight their way out, but they were cut down by the King's Guard and Lannister men. Mace Tyrell was dragged away in chains, roaring in anguish. Margaery collapsed in shock, only to be seized by the guards once more. Joffrey, face splattered with blood, brandished his sword, proclaiming himself the true power of the realm. "Any who dare betray me will suffer the same fate," he shouted, his voice cracking with unhinged triumph. That night, King's Landing was quieter than death. The festival ended in massacre. House Tyrell's highest members were imprisoned or dead, their retainers scattered, hunted, or forced to bend the knee. Margaery was thrown into a tower cell, alone with her grief. Cersei later visited her in secret, claiming to show some measure of pity. But it was a hollow gesture. Margaery was to remain the queen in name, but she was effectively a hostage, her father's life and her own dependent on total obedience to Joffrey's will. The next day, the city awoke to find heads mounted on spikes outside the Red Keep. Tyrell knights, squires, and servants. Olenna Tyrell's body was displayed in the courtyard as a warning to all who might think to cross King Joffrey. Thus began the darkest chapter of Joffrey's reign. Cersei believed her son had finally secured power for House Lannister, but she had sown a monster that even she could scarcely control. Tywin looked upon the slaughter with anger. Slaying so many Tyrells put the realm in jeopardy. Yet what could he do? Any move against Joffrey now would pit father against grandson, a civil war within the Lannister family. He retreated to his chambers, dispatching urgent letters to the major lords of the realm, trying to hold together an alliance that had been shattered. Many in the Reach, upon hearing of Olenna's murder, prepared for war. The breadbasket of the kingdom would not long remain loyal to the king who had butchered one of its most beloved figures. Tyrion walked through the corridors of the Red Keep, haunted by what he had witnessed. He felt a profound sadness at Olenna's death, at Margaery's imprisonment, at the savage crackdown that left the city quivering in fear. He tried to corner Joffrey in the council chamber, hoping to reason with him, but the boy king only laughed. He told Tyrion that if he was so concerned about the realm, he should stay out of the way. When Tyrion pushed further, Joffrey threatened to execute Sansa should she ever be found, and then have Tyrion thrown in the dungeon as her accomplice. After that, Tyrion stayed silent, drifting from one day to the next in a haze of guilt and anxiety. The wars began in earnest soon after. House Tyrell's bannermen rose up in rebellion. Stannis Baratheon, sensing weakness, launched an assault on King's Landing from the sea. Tywin mustered every available soldier to repel the invaders. The Crown's forces were stretched thin. Battles flared across the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Crownlands themselves. King's Landing turned into a fortress under siege, with gates barred, walls manned day and night, and the city's population trembling at the prospect of another sack. All the while, Joffrey reveled in the bloodshed, proclaiming himself the greatest war king Westeros had ever seen. He oversaw the distribution of wildfire, personally indulging in the spectacle of watching enemy ships burn in Blackwater Bay, convinced that no foe could stand against him. Yet the more Joffrey fought, the more resentment and terror he spread. Rumors reached even the smallest villages of what happened to House Tyrell, of the heads mounted on spikes. People spoke of a queen imprisoned, her grandmother murdered, and a boy king drunk on his own cruelty. Foreign powers took notice. In Dorne, Prince Doran Martell received word of the chaos, and though he moved cautiously, he saw the chance for Dorne to gain greater autonomy. In the Iron Islands, Balon Greyjoy and his heirs plotted renewed raids on the western coast, figuring that the crown's forces were preoccupied. Everywhere in Westeros, the spirit of rebellion simmered. The realm was a patchwork of mistrust and aggression, just waiting for the next spark. Meanwhile, a cold wind blew from the north. The wall stood, manned by too few brothers of the Night's Watch, as the threat of the White Walkers became all the more real. But the war-torn Seven Kingdoms had little attention to spare for the creeping darkness. Joffrey refused to dispatch any significant help. In fact, when ravens arrived pleading for men and supplies, Joffrey ordered them burned unread, calling the Night's Watch a relic of fools. Winter was coming, yet Joffrey's pride blinded him to the encroaching nightmare. In the hidden corners of the Red Keep, a final conspiracy stirred. Tyrion, Varys, and a handful of lords, some lesser Lannisters, some knights disgusted by Joffrey's excesses, resolved that the only way to save the realm was to end Joffrey's life. This time, their plan was less subtle. It involved an assassin, a hidden crossbow, and an arranged ambush near the royal chambers. But Joffrey, paranoid as he was, had doubled his guard after the Tyrell fiasco. He rarely moved about the castle without a detachment of the Kingsguard and a squad of gold cloaks. He slept in rooms guarded by locked iron doors. He ate food only after it had been tasted by 3 different servants. The conspirators realized this was no easy task. Days turned into weeks as they tried to find a moment of vulnerability, but Joffrey gave them none. In a fit of frustration, Tyrion told Varys that perhaps they should align with Stannis. Varys stroked his chin, weighing the possibility. But Stannis's men were fervent in their worship of the Lord of Light, and no one could guarantee that the realm would be better under Stannis's rule. Still, it had to be better than the madness of Joffrey. Plans were drawn up for secret messages to be sent across the lines, proposing a partnership to remove the king. But before the conspirators could act, tragedy struck within the Red Keep once more. Cersei, seeing the realm collapse around her beloved son, began to fear for his life. She insisted that he tighten security further, even going so far as to personally oversee the vetting of every servant. She grew suspicious of Tyrion and demanded that he be watched. The tension between them boiled over in a small council meeting, where Cersei accused Tyrion of plotting treason. Joffrey took his mother's side, hurling insults at his uncle. Tyrion attempted to remain calm, but when Joffrey threatened to torture Tyrion for answers, Tyrion finally snapped and insulted the king openly. The room fell silent as Joffrey stared, incensed. Without hesitation, Joffrey commanded the gold cloaks to arrest Tyrion for treason. In that moment, Tyrion knew there was no escape. He had no real allies left at the table. Varys was silent, Baelish gone to the Vale, and any sense of justice was drowned under Joffrey's tyranny. Tyrion was seized and dragged off, leaving behind a stunned council. That evening, Joffrey announced that Tyrion would stand trial for conspiring to murder the king and for aiding Sansa Stark's escape. The potential punishment was clear: death. The trial was held quickly, in the same great hall now draped in the macabre memory of blood and betrayal. Witnesses were paraded forth, some bribed, others threatened. They spouted lies or twisted truths, painting Tyrion as the mastermind behind every conspiracy from the wedding day onward. Joffrey presided with a manic glee. Cersei, seated nearby, watched with vengeful satisfaction. Tyrion, exhausted by the charade, demanded a trial by combat. At first, Joffrey refused, wanting the pleasure of condemning Tyrion outright. But Cersei, knowing the tradition and the eyes of the realm upon them, insisted they grant the dwarf his final chance. Joffrey agreed with mock pity, naming Ser Meryn Trant as the crown's champion. Tyrion looked around, hoping someone would volunteer to fight for him. But who would stand for Tyrion now? Bronn was gone, likely chased away or bribed by the crown. Jaime stood silent, torn between love for his brother and fear of the unstoppable wave of tyranny. Ultimately, Jaime stepped forward, the memory of their bond surmounting his fear. He would fight on Tyrion's behalf. Joffrey's eyes gleamed at the prospect of uncle killing uncle, or one uncle killing the other. The day of the duel arrived. Jaime, still a formidable swordsman even with his golden hand, faced Ser Meryn Trant in the yard. Courtiers watched, anticipating blood. Joffrey perched on a balcony, face twisted in sadistic delight. Swords clashed in a flurry of steel. Jaime fought with skill, but his missing hand hampered him. Ser Meryn, though no knight of great renown, had youth and both hands on his side. The duel was vicious, with Jaime forced on the defensive time and again. Then, with a sudden lunge, Trant's blade sliced across Jaime's side. The Kingslayer reeled, blood staining his tunic. An audible gasp went up from the crowd, and Tyrion felt his heart drop. Jaime pressed on, parrying desperately, but he was wounded. Ser Meryn battered Jaime's defenses until, in a final blow, he disarmed him. Jaime fell to his knees, clutching his wound. Trant raised his sword to deliver the coup de grace, glancing up at King Joffrey as if for permission. Joffrey, eager for his uncle's death, gave a small nod. The sword descended, and Jaime Lannister's life ended there, in the Red Keep's courtyard, to the echo of horrified cries. Tyrion sank to his knees, tears in his eyes, his brother's name dying in his throat. The hush that followed was like the silence of a tomb. With that, Tyrion's hope was extinguished. He looked to Joffrey, saw the glee on his face, and realized that the realm was lost to madness. Joffrey pronounced Tyrion guilty. There was no one left to save him. Days later, Tyrion met his own fate at the headsman's block, ironically in the very courtyard where so many had perished. He went to his death with defiance, cursing Joffrey's name for all to hear. With a single swing of the greatsword, the Lannister dwarf was gone, leaving only a pool of blood and a final, haunting silence. In the aftermath, Joffrey's tyranny only grew. He stood triumphant over the corpses of his enemies. His uncle, the Queen of Thorns, countless Tyrell knights, rebellious lords, and soon perhaps even Stannis. The war raged on, but Joffrey's single-minded cruelty held the capital in an iron grip. Inside her tower cell, Margaery Tyrell grew thin and pale, her spirit broken by grief. She would never forgive herself for not pushing her grandmother to act sooner, or for trusting that Joffrey's heart could be swayed. Outside the walls, the small folk suffered, starved, and sometimes rose in futile revolts, only to be crushed by the gold cloaks and the king's cruelty. The riverlands burned once more, the north prepared for winter without southern aid, and the Iron Islands took advantage of the chaos to plunder coastal villages. And so King Joffrey sat the Iron Throne, unpoisoned and unopposed in the heart of the capital. In time, Daenerys Targaryen might cross the sea with her dragons, or Stannis Baratheon might rally enough forces for a final push, or the White Walkers might swarm down from the north to bring a terror beyond mortal comprehension. But for now, the boy king held his seat, too cruel to tolerate dissent, too arrogant to consider mercy. The realm he ruled was fractured and bleeding, and those who once had the chance to end his reign lamented their failure. If only Olenna Tyrell had slipped that poison into his cup at the wedding, how different the world might have been. Instead, Westeros buckled under the reign of a tyrant, and the fires of war threatened to consume the Seven Kingdoms, with nothing to check the cruelty of a king who knew no bounds. In the days following Tyrion's execution, an uneasy silence gripped the Red Keep. Servants moved with eyes cast down, terrified that even the slightest misstep might provoke the king's wrath. Smoke from distant fires hung in the air, and within the castle's thick walls, the mood was as stale and oppressive as the city beyond. King Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, had consolidated power in the worst way possible. By wading through blood, Tyrell blood, Lannister blood, and the blood of small folk who had no more use than to feed the crown's growing appetite for fear, Tywin Lannister had retreated to his solar, seldom emerging except for rare small council meetings. The hand of the king was a shadow of his former self, suffering beneath the weight of Joffrey's extravagances and the war that now ravaged the realm on multiple fronts. The alliance with Highgarden had collapsed into open hostility. Some of the Tyrell bannermen were attacking Crownland's holdings in an effort to draw royal forces south. Meanwhile, Stannis Baratheon had grown bolder, bolstered by his new relationship with the Iron Bank. Reports suggested an amassing of ships off the coast of Dragonstone, potentially the largest fleet he had ever commanded. Cersei, for her part, seemed caught between triumph and dread. She had always taught Joffrey to be strong, to rule with an iron fist, believing that kindness was weakness. But now the boy she had shaped was beyond her control, a fire that consumed everything in its path, including his own family. She would spend hours pacing her apartments, wringing her hands in uncharacteristic agitation, snapping at Maester Pycelle or at any servant who came too close. At night, she visited Joffrey's chambers, not with maternal warmth, but with an air of calculated concern. She cajoled him to take fewer risks, to show a modicum of mercy, for the sake of stability if nothing else, but her words often fell on deaf ears. Joffrey would merely smirk, or else launch into a tirade about how she, too, might be plotting against him. With no small effort, she would placate him, reminding him she was his mother and only wished his glory. When the small council did meet, it met under duress. Half of its usual members were dead or had fled. Grand Maester Pycelle remained, quivering with age and fear. Lord Varys still attended, his face inscrutable, as though nothing the king did could surprise him anymore. Mace Tyrell was now a prisoner in the dungeons, so his seat was vacant, a silent testament to the shattered alliance. In his father's stead, Kevan Lannister appeared at sessions, but Kevan's mild temperament and devotion to Tywin meant he rarely spoke unless invited. Cersei herself hovered near Joffrey, but seldom offered policy that ran counter to her son's mania. Joffrey occupied the hand's chair at the head of the council table more often than Tywin did. He slouched in it, leg draped over an armrest, occasionally demanding new levies of gold and troops, or giving orders that hardly made sense. Tywin insisted that the city strengthen its defenses in anticipation of a siege. King's Landing was an unwieldy mass of winding streets and cramped houses, and the chaos of the War of the Five Kings had left it in disrepair. Tywin ordered more grain to be stockpiled. He dispatched ravens to the Westerlands, commanding every minor lord to send men. His instructions to Kevan were to muster an additional force from Lannisport. But word soon returned that morale was low. Many of those lords were reluctant to march under a banner that served Joffrey. They feared the boy king's cruelty nearly as much as they feared the threat of invasion. Only Tywin's name still held enough sway to force compliance, but it was grudging. Even in the Westerlands, men questioned whether Joffrey was worth dying for. While King's Landing braced for war, the streets teemed with rumors. One day, it was said that Daenerys Targaryen had landed in Dorne with 3 full-grown dragons. The next, that the others had breached the wall and were marching south. Such tales were mostly the product of fear and fancy, yet they captured the unsettled mood of the city. No one felt safe. The Gold Cloaks patrolled day and night, under strict orders to snuff out any sign of sedition. Public executions became a regular event in the squares, where Joffrey's soldiers posted wanted notices for Sansa Stark and any who might harbor her. The bounty on Sansa's head was exorbitant, enough to buy small castles or large tracts of land. But few had any clue where she was. She might have escaped by ship or fled into the countryside. Perhaps she had even perished on the roads. Her fate was a mystery that gnawed at Joffrey, a small but constant thorn in his pride. Far below the Red Keep, In the dank dungeons, Marjorie Tyrell endured her captivity. She was not thrown into a filthy black cell like some base criminal. Joffrey's twisted sense of theatrics demanded she be kept in a tower as a guest of the crown. The accommodations were not entirely squalid. There was a bed, a privy, and enough room to pace. But she was guarded at all times, rarely allowed to leave, and given only the bare minimum of comfort. Each day that passed, she felt herself dwindling. If her grandmother's death had been a knife through her heart, what followed was a slow bleed that left her hollow. Yet she did not abandon all hope. On some nights, she would light the stub of a candle, stand at the narrow window, and look out over the city. In the far distance, she could see flickers of campfires beyond the walls. Stannis's forces, perhaps, or some other army gathering in the gloom. She prayed, though not with much faith, that someone out there still cared enough to free her from her living nightmare. Her guards were mostly silent men, chosen for their loyalty to Joffrey. Once in a while, one would slip and show a hint of pity. He might bring her an extra chunk of bread or a second blanket when the nights grew cold. Marjorie would thank him politely, never pressing too far. She learned from these small interactions that morale was low even among Joffrey's men. The constant fear of incurring the king's wrath wore on them. Nevertheless, no one dared openly sympathize with the captive queen. Should Joffrey suspect them, they would swiftly find themselves in worse straits than she. Sometimes Marjorie dreamed of a daring rescue. She saw Loras riding up the city streets, resplendent in armor, flanked by roses and cheering crowds, come to sweep her away. But Loras was either dead or scattered with the remnants of the Tyrell host. Rumors conflicted on that count, and none had seen him in King's Landing for moons. Other times, she imagined that somehow the walls of her cell would crumble, giving her wings to fly far from this place. Yet daybreak always proved such fantasies false. She woke, still imprisoned, still trapped in a life that seemed less real every moment. Up in the Tower of the Hand, Tywin Lannister considered what might be done about his grandson. Even the cold discipline of Tywin's heart could not fully stifle the sorrow he felt for Jaime's death. He had always disapproved of Jaime's choices, especially regarding the Kingsguard vow, but he was still his eldest son, the golden boy of Casterly Rock. To see him perish in trial by combat, fighting for Tyrion, was a blow that Tywin struggled to bear. With Tyrion dead as well, House Lannister had lost two of its brightest, if deeply flawed, children. All that remained was Cersei, and by extension Joffrey. That put the Lannister legacy in a perilous predicament. Tywin told himself that he had to remain strong, that he had to preserve the family name. But how? Joffrey's cruelty was driving them all toward destruction. Late one night, Tywin summoned Kevan and a handful of trusted Lannister cousins. In hushed voices, they spoke of contingency plans. If the city fell to Stannis or to open rebellion, they would withdraw to the Westerlands and fortify Casterly Rock. Yet the notion of abandoning King's Landing after so much had been sacrificed galled Tywin. He insisted they must not let the crown slip away, no matter how distasteful Joffrey's methods were. Kevan, more pragmatic, wondered aloud if the Boy King could be guided from behind the scenes. Perhaps if Joffrey were told that Stannis had made inroads, they could orchestrate a scenario in which Joffrey was removed for his own safety, spirited away, while someone else took the throne. But Tywin bristled at any talk of dethroning his own flesh and blood, no matter how monstrous that flesh and blood had become. In the end, the meeting resolved nothing. They parted with grim faces, each privately doubting the future. Meanwhile, the Iron Bank's gold was not wasted. Stannis Baratheon had purchased ships, sellswords, and supplies. The Red Priestess Melisandre preached that the flames showed Stannis's moment was nigh. Davos Seaworth worked tirelessly to secure alliances among minor lords who hated Joffrey's tyranny. Fleets began to circle Dragonstone, drifting along the coast in sight of King's Landing. Periodically, they tested the city's defenses, sending small raiding parties to probe the royal fleet. Often, the seas were lit by patches of wildfire, but each skirmish drained men from both sides. Stannis, cold and resolute, planned a grand assault that would succeed where the Battle of the Blackwater had failed. He would not rely on a single cunning plan with wildfire. Instead, he would grind the city down by blockade, forging alliances with any Crownland's lords who dared turn cloak. And many would, given Joffrey's cruelty. In the countryside south of King's Landing, Randyll Tarly's banners marched. Tarly had been forced to fight for the crown when House Tyrell still served Joffrey, but after the massacre of Olenna Tyrell and the imprisonment of Margaery, Tarly's loyalties wavered. He was known as a stern, formidable commander, loyal to Highgarden above all. Yet Highgarden was in disarray. Mace Tyrell rotted in a dungeon. Garland Tyrell was said to be leading what remained of the Reach's loyal forces, and Loras's fate was unknown. Some said he still led a roving band of knights determined to rescue Margaery. Others insisted he had been killed in a failed skirmish near Bitterbridge. The confusion allowed Tarly the freedom to choose his own path. For now, he maintained the guise of neutrality, refusing to commit to open rebellion, but also refusing to assist Joffrey's cause. His men lived off the land, moving from one camp to the next, which only spread the region's misery further. Starving peasants resented every army that trampled their fields, no matter its banner. Within the Red Keep, a peculiar tension emerged between Joffrey and Cersei. Having tasted absolute power, Joffrey believed himself above all counsel, including his mother's. Cersei, worried about Stannis' looming threat, pleaded with Joffrey to coordinate with Tywin for a robust defense plan, to recall any Lannister or Crownland's troops scattered across the realm, to quell revolts in a more diplomatic manner so the city wouldn't starve under siege. But Joffrey sneered at her suggestions. He accused her of trying to undermine his authority, of siding with Tywin against him. On more than one occasion, he threatened to name her a traitor should she persist. Only once she cowered and apologized did he relent. The dynamic between mother and son had shifted alarmingly. Cersei, who had been the iron-willed manipulator of kings, found herself dethroned in her own home by the uncontrollable cruelty of the boy she had raised. A pall settled over the great corridors. Along with the stench of fear, an undercurrent of unspoken plots began to build. Varys, ever watchful, flitted through the Red Keep like a soft-footed ghost. He no longer pretended to mask his worry. Sometimes he visited Margaery's tower, under the pretense of delivering fresh linens or herbal remedies. He spoke to her in measured tones, carefully, knowing the guards could be listening. He hinted that many within the city yearned for her freedom, that there might come a moment when chaos presented an opportunity to escape. Margaery listened, gratitude shining in her weary eyes, though she wondered if Varys had the power to fulfill any promise. Another time, Varys slipped into Tywin's solar, offering cryptic pieces of intelligence, tidbits about the Gold Cloak's morale, or stories of mass desertions in the Crown's lesser garrisons. Tywin heard him out but rarely replied, knowing that Varys told him only half-truths, aiming to shape the outcome in ways unknown. "I serve the realm," Varys would say with his trademark politeness, and Tywin, who trusted almost no one, could not decide whether that was reassuring or damning. While King's Landing seethed, the rest of Westeros hardly fared better. In the north, Roose Bolton and his bastard son Ramsay oversaw Winterfell, but their hold was precarious. The lords of the north despised them, resenting the betrayal of House Stark. With no relief coming from the south, winter closing in, and scattered rumors that the undead had been spotted near abandoned villages, the people of the north prepared for doom in silent resignation. Some began to invoke the names of the old Stark kings, praying for retribution. A handful of hidden loyalists to the Stark cause planned sabotage against the Boltons, but fear and the memory of the Red Wedding kept them from uniting. Further up at the wall, the Night's Watch braced for an enemy far beyond the petty squabbles of kings, while their pleas to the Iron Throne went unanswered. In the Vale, Peter Baelish Littlefinger stirred. He had gained significant influence over young Lord Robert Arryn, and used it to further his ambitions. Baelish saw Joffrey's unraveling realm as a perfect stage for cunning manipulation. If the capital fell, the Vale stood a chance of emerging relatively unscathed, giving Baelish the leverage to play kingmaker, or so he hoped. Word had reached him that Sansa Stark might be in the Riverlands, possibly traveling under an assumed name. If so, Peter had every intention of finding her. She was a valuable piece, a claim to the north if played correctly. Amid these swirling forces, King's Landing sat on the brink of another siege. The city's gates were barred each night, and the watch doubled. The cost of food soared. Bread riots became common, though swiftly suppressed by the gold cloaks. Pyromancers under the orders of Joffrey stocked caches of wildfire along the walls in case of a naval assault. Stories from the War of the Five Kings told how Tyrion's cunning had nearly destroyed Stannis' fleet with wildfire at the Blackwater. Now, with Tyrion gone, Joffrey assumed he would replicate that strategy on his own, oblivious to the complexities that had made it successful once, and to the possibility that the city itself might burn if the substance was misused. Late one evening, when the sky was dark with storm clouds, a quiet visitor arrived at the city by boat, slipping through the outskirts of the harbor under a forged pass. The visitor was clad in a plain hooded cloak. Beneath that hood was a face many might recognize: Brienne of Tarth. She had come south under oath to Catelyn Stark, having failed once to keep her vow to protect Lady Stark's daughters. Now she carried fresh rumors that Sansa might have taken refuge with sympathetic riverlords. Brienne's presence in King's Landing was a desperate gamble. She intended to speak with anyone who might help her find Sansa, or at least confirm whether the girl was truly gone. If discovered, Brienne would be labeled a traitor and executed without question. Still, her sense of honor drove her forward. She made her way through the lower city, observing the worn faces of small folk, the banners of the gold cloaks, the hush of curfew broken only by distant sobs or the crack of whips. King's Landing felt even grimmer than before. She found a cellar in a rundown alley near the mud gate, paying a pittance of coin to a crone who asked no questions. The next day, disguised as a peasant, she lurked near the Red Keep's gates. She watched from afar, hoping to catch sight of Sansa or glean rumors. Instead, she learned only of Joffrey's new tyranny, how the Tyrells were destroyed, how Tyrion was dead, how Marjorie was captive. The more she heard, the graver her expression became. She heard mention of Sansa's unknown whereabouts and the vast bounty on her head. The city was too dangerous to linger in for long, but Brienne's vow kept her tethered. She wandered the back streets, searching for any whisper of the girl's fate. On the third night, a pair of gold cloaks confronted her near Flea Bottom. Her sturdy frame and the sword at her side drew suspicion. She tried to feign ignorance, saying she was a sellsword seeking service. The gold cloaks demanded she come with them to explain herself more thoroughly. Brienne, realizing how precarious her situation was, tried to defuse matters peacefully. But when one of them attempted to seize her, she struck him down in a flash of steel. The second guard lunged with a spear, only to have it knocked aside. Within seconds, both men lay bleeding on the ground. She fled into the warren of alleys, heart pounding. Shouts rose behind her as more guards were alerted. She slipped through a cluster of beggars, scaled a low wall, and managed to lose her pursuers in the labyrinth. At dawn, she left the city the same way she'd come, by boat, hiding in the hold, uncertain of her next move. She had confirmed only one thing: Sansa was not in the Red Keep. If she was in King's Landing at all, Brienne could not find her. With Joffrey's net cast so wide, it seemed likely that the girl was elsewhere. 2 days later, the city woke to the sound of horns. Stannis' fleet had drawn closer, a formation of war galleys arrayed on the horizon. Siege weapons stood on the decks, ready to hurl flaming projectiles. Joffrey called a war council in the throne room, demanding every available soldier man the defenses. Tywin insisted on a more measured approach, pointing out that an all-out confrontation on the water might expose them to the same type of wildfire attack that once decimated Stannis' forces. Joffrey, enraged that his grandfather dared contradict him, shouted him down, declaring that he would personally command the battle from the walls. Cersei tried to dissuade him. She argued that the king's life was too valuable to risk on the ramparts, that he should remain in the safety of the Red Keep. Joffrey spat back that a true king led from the front. He would watch the seas burn, and if needed, he would unleash a new wave of wildfire that would consume Stannis's entire fleet. Cersei's fear of losing her son clashed with her fear of provoking him further. She fell silent, and Joffrey saw her silence as compliance. That evening, torches lit the outer battlements of King's Landing, and the walls bristled with archers. Massive chain booms were readied near the river's mouth to block any ships from retreating once they ventured into the Blackwater. The pyromancers bustled about, distributing jars of wildfire. The city was as tense as a drawn bowstring, with watchers on every tower scanning the dark waves for movement. But Stannis did not commit to a direct assault that night. Instead, he maintained his blockade, waiting for King's Landing to starve or to fracture from within. Food within the city continued to dwindle. The small folk bore the worst of it, forced to subsist on watery stew or stale bread if they could find it at all. Violence flared in the poorer districts, and the gold cloaks, themselves disgruntled, cracked down brutally. Disease crept in, as it often did in times of siege, and rumors of a pox outbreak began to swirl. Joffrey spent his days locked in the Red Keep, occasionally venturing to the walls for show. Each time he marched through the streets, flanked by gold cloaks and Kingsguard, he beheld frightened, malnourished faces. He sneered and told them to thank him for defending the city. Some knelt out of sheer terror, others out of desperate hope that obedience might yield relief. None received any. Inside her cell, Margaery felt the city's desperation like a distant tremor. The air that reached her window reeked of sewage and rot. She fell into a coughing fit at times, though she was not sure if it was the foul air or her own sorrow that made her lungs ache. She tried to gather what little information she could from the guards, but they were tight-lipped. Some nights, she would see flickers of green fire out over the bay. She imagined it was more wildfire tests or small skirmishes, and on those nights, she would remember how she'd once stood beside Joffrey at a feast, trying to smile for the people, never realizing how swiftly illusions could shatter. One day, in the late afternoon, Margaery was startled by a gentle knock at the door of her tower room. Usually, her guards gave a brusque command before entering. She stood, smoothing her rumpled gown, uncertain what to expect. The knock came again, soft yet insistent. Finally, a guard unlocked the door and pushed it open, allowing a robed figure to step inside. Margaery's breath caught when she recognized Varys, hood drawn low, carrying a small wooden box. He dismissed the guard with a curt nod, murmuring that the king had commanded him to bring fresh clothing for the queen. The guard bowed and left, sealing the door behind him. Margaery watched Varys approach, a flicker of hope in her chest. Varys placed the box on the narrow table and opened it, revealing a set of plain garments and a small jar of ointment. He spoke in a low whisper, explaining that the ointment was for her cough, courtesy of Grand Maester Pycelle. Then, lowering his voice further, he told her that he had news from the outside. He said that war was coming to the city in earnest, that a decisive battle might be only days away. House Tyrell's surviving lords were massing around the Mander, preparing to cut off King's Landing from the south. Meanwhile, Stannis lay in wait with his fleet. The city was almost encircled. He told her that if a breach occurred, if fighting spilled into the streets, she must be ready to flee. She asked him how. He said that he was working on that a friend of a friend might be able to spirit her out through a hidden passage beneath the Red Keep. The city was riddled with them, some unknown even to Joffrey. Margaery stared at Varys, her eyes pooling with tears. "And why would you help me?" she asked, voice unsteady. Varys gave a small, almost sad smile. "I have found that a king's cruelty spares no one, not even those who once believed themselves safe. You do not deserve to languish here, and the realm needs less tragedy. My motives are my own, but suffice it to say I prefer a gentler hand on the throne." She nodded, swallowing hard. The mention of the throne reminded her of too many horrors. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Varys replied that she must watch for a signal. 3 candle flames in her window on a moonless night. That would be her cue to be ready. He would come with someone to guide her. "It may be your only chance," he warned. Margaery closed her eyes, inhaling slowly. "I will be ready." Varys slipped away as quietly as he had come, leaving her with new garments and the jar of ointment. He had no illusions that her captivity would improve in the interim, but at least she had hope, however faint. From that day on, Marjorie prayed for a moonless night, and for the swirl of chaos that might set her free. She hated the thought that more lives would be lost, that the city might be ravaged, but she saw no path to her liberty otherwise. Joffrey would never release her willingly, not after what he had done to her grandmother, not after the countless humiliations he had inflicted. In the Great Hall, Joffrey's tantrums escalated. He would call assemblies of the Gold Cloaks and browbeat their officers for not apprehending more traitors. He demanded they comb every alley, every hovel, every street corner for hidden conspirators. He threatened to drag the entire population of Flea Bottom before him if necessary. The Gold Cloaks, many of them exhausted and demoralized, responded with perfunctory salutes. But behind their eyes lay resentment. Their pay was erratic, their loved ones as hungry as the rest. All they had was fear to bind them to the crown. At the same time, Joffrey took a renewed interest in Marjorie. Perhaps he sensed that she was slipping from his grasp, or maybe he simply craved a distraction from the threat at the gates. One day, he announced he would visit his beloved queen in her tower. He arrived with 2 Kingsguard, Ser Marentrant and Ser Boros Blunt. Finding Marjorie alone, he dismissed the guards to wait outside. When the door closed, he studied her silently. She stood, head bowed, trembling. The sight of her fear lit a twisted spark in his eyes. With slow steps, he circled her, trailing a gloved hand over the back of a chair, the rim of her water jug. Marjorie forced herself to remain composed, though she felt ice in her veins. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "what brings you to my chamber?" Joffrey let out a soft laugh that held no warmth. "I was wondering if you might have something to confess. Considering how your family conspired against me, you must have known something." She risked a glance at his face, saw the cruelty there, the deepening lines of paranoia. "I knew nothing," she replied, voice shaking despite herself. "My grandmother acted without my knowledge. I wish I could take it all back." He interrupted with a sneer. "Lies. You all lie. You Tyrell women, so skilled at weaving your pretty illusions. Do you think I'm an idiot?" She shook her head, tears threatening. "No, never. I only—" He slapped her, the blow snapping her head to the side. She nearly fell, catching herself against the table. Pain and shock mingled in her mind. "Don't you dare grovel," he hissed, "pretending you're innocent. You'd kill me if you could." Marjorie tasted blood in her mouth. Her vision swam as she recalled the moment he'd run his sword through Olenna. Fear and hatred warred in her chest, but she kept her tone as meek as possible. "I have no power, Your Grace," she said, voice trembling. "I'm at your mercy." Joffrey inhaled sharply, seeming to relish the sight of her distress. Then he turned for the door. "Yes, you are," he said simply, and left. In his wake, Marjorie sank to the floor, a sob escaping her lips. She understood now, fully, that staying here meant not just captivity but constant danger of whatever cruelty he might decide to inflict. She clung to Varys's promise like a drowning person clings to driftwood. Not long after, the storms moved in from the sea, darkening the skies for days on end. Under the cloak of those storms, Stannis's fleet maneuvered closer to the gullet, threatening to blockade all shipping routes to King's Landing. Food caravans from the south slowed to a trickle as rebels in the Reach struck Crown forces. Tywin tried to rally some countermeasures. He sent riders to Harrenhal, commanded the river lords to hold certain key crossings. But the realm was too fractured. Many lords simply ignored the summons, preferring to wait and see which side would emerge victorious. In one of these storms, the first sign of horror came from the northern road. Travelers fleeing the area around the Trident brought whispers of shambling corpses, of a creeping cold that froze entire villages. Most folk dismissed such talk as nonsense. But in the Red Keep, a battered raven arrived for Maester Pycelle, carrying a desperate message from the Night's Watch. It spoke of White Walkers, of an army of the dead. Pycelle, trembling, carried the message straight to Tywin, who read it by candlelight. Tywin's face remained impassive, but inside he felt a twinge of dread. Yet what could be done? The realm was at war, the capital on the brink of siege. Joffrey would never send men north. And so Tywin placed the message in a drawer, uncertain whom he could even trust with such dire tidings. That same night, Varys carried another letter, taking secret passages that wove beneath the castle. He did not take it to the king or to Tywin. Instead, he delivered it to a red-haired girl in the back room of a brothel near the city's edge. Sansa Stark, alive, had been in King's Landing all along, hidden in the very heart of the city she once called home. With the help of sympathetic souls, Varys had arranged her concealment, orchestrating a chain of safe houses that had enabled her to vanish beyond Joffrey's reach. She was no longer the naive girl who arrived as a betrothed hostage. She had seen death and betrayal, had been forced into a marriage with Tyrion, and had lost him as well. Varys's reasons for protecting her were many, but chief among them was that Sansa Stark still had a claim to the north, one that might prove useful in shaping the realm's future. For now, she lived in secrecy, guided by Varys's network. She read the letter he brought. It was short, a warning that the city might soon erupt in battle. "You must be ready to flee if the walls are breached," Varys told her in hushed tones. "Stannis's men may not spare any Lannister or perceived ally, and if Joffrey prevails, the purge of traitors will only intensify." Sansa looked at him with hollow eyes. She was thin, her hair unkempt, her cheeks sallow from living in fear, yet a resolute spark remained. She nodded. "I won't go back to the Red Keep," she whispered. "I'd rather die than face him again." Varys placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I understand. There may be a moment, if the gods are good, when you can escape into the chaos. I will try to help you, but you must be cautious." With that, he slipped away, leaving her to her solitude. She thought of Tyrion, of the last time she saw him standing in the Great Hall, condemned to die. She had shed tears for him, though she had barely known how to comfort him or whether he wanted her pity. She prayed he had found some peace in the afterlife that eluded her in this one. As the days grew darker, the tension finally broke. Stannis made his move, launching a series of coordinated night raids on the outlying watchtowers by sea and by land. The black waters lit with flaming projectiles. Joffrey stood on the ramparts, shrieking at his men to unleash wildfire. Tywin, alarmed by how quickly events were unfolding, tried to oversee a strategic defense from a vantage in the gatehouse. The gold cloaks manned the scorpions and ballistae, loosing bolts at Stannis' ships. Some struck their targets, setting enemy decks aflame, but Stannis had come prepared. Many vessels had been outfitted with thick hulls and rigging designed to disperse or extinguish wildfire quickly. The fighting raged through the night. Screams carried on the wind, mingling with the crash of waves and the roar of flames. By dawn, both sides had taken losses, but King's Landing still stood, battered yet unbreached. Yet that was only the beginning. Stannis had made a feint at the harbor. His real effort was aimed at the landward side of the city, near the old Rosby Road. There, under cover of darkness, his sellswords and a contingent of loyal knights advanced, braving the muddy terrain to reach the city's walls. By the time Joffrey realized the threat, they were already laying siege to the gates. Bells rang frantically. The gold cloaks scrambled to man the ramparts. Joffrey rushed to the scene, ignoring Tywin's advice to keep a vantage in the Red Keep. He wanted to be where he could see blood spilled in his name. High above them all, in her tower cell, Marjorie heard the alarms. She peered through the narrow window and saw torches bobbing outside the walls. A wave of terror and hope washed over her. If the city fell, she might be freed or she might perish in the chaos. She thought of Varys's words, about watching for 3 candles on a moonless night. The sky was overcast now, no moon visible, but neither were any signals. She forced herself to remain patient. The next day, she noticed that her guard detail had changed. The men seemed more tense, less inclined to speak. A hush clung to every corridor of the Red Keep. The tension told her that Stannis was pressing closer. By midday, the fighting escalated around the Rosby Gate. The clang of steel and the boom of siege engines reverberated through the city. Civilians fled deeper inside, clogging the streets. Joffrey, from atop the walls, yelled orders to the archers. Wildfire barrels were tossed over the parapets, green flames erupting among Stannis's ranks. Men screamed as they burned alive. For a moment, it seemed that Joffrey's savage methods might hold the line. But Stannis's men kept coming, pushing siege towers into place. The red banners of the Lord of Light waved in the smoky air. From within the city, watchers saw the towers creeping closer, unstoppable as doom. Among the king's defenders, morale began to waver. Many gold cloaks had no appetite for another brutal battle. They'd heard the stories of the Blackwater. Now they saw the same carnage repeated with fewer resources and less cunning. Their king was a boy tyrant, shrieking for more fire, more death, as though that alone could preserve his rule. Tywin tried to reinforce the gate with a contingent of knights from the Westerlands, but they were stretched thin. Scouts rushed to report that pockets of rebels in the Crownlands were attacking supply wagons, preventing reinforcements from arriving. Everywhere, it seemed the land had turned against the Iron Throne. Even some Lannister bannermen were slow to answer Tywin's call, uncertain if Joffrey's cause was still worth fighting for. The next night, the city was rocked by a vicious assault from the sea. Stannis's fleet pounded the harbor walls with catapults, raining flaming shot into the city. The narrow streets below the Red Keep erupted in chaos. People screamed, trying to quench fires. Joffrey, incensed, demanded the pyromancers load up more wildfire on catapults of their own. In the frenzy, safety precautions were all but forgotten. The result was a disastrous explosion near the King's Gate when a stray spark ignited a store of wildfire before it could be launched. A portion of the city wall collapsed in the blast, killing scores of defenders and blasting a hole wide enough for an attacking force to exploit. Though the breach was partially blocked by rubble, Stannis's men saw the chance. They surged forward, clashing with the remnants of gold cloaks who had not fled or been incinerated. Joffrey watched from the ramparts, howling for them to hold, threatening to execute any man who retreated. Some defenders obeyed, paralyzed by fear, but others had had enough. They threw down their weapons and ran. The city was on the verge of capitulation. News reached Tywin, who hurried to the site trying to rally a defense. But after so many short-handed battles, even he could not conjure men out of thin air. King's Landing's defenders were buckling. Within the Red Keep, the panic was palpable. Servants gathered what they could carry and prepared to flee or hide. Doors were locked and barred. Cersei paced in her chambers, a goblet of wine trembling in her hand. She was no stranger to siege, recalling how she'd nearly poisoned Tommen during the previous attack by Stannis. But now, her golden-haired younger son was gone, murdered by the Faith militant months ago in another timeline, or so it might as well have been, for she never saw him in this one. Instead, she had only Joffrey, the monstrous child king whose arrogance had driven them all to this brink. She muttered half-mad prayers to the Seven, cursing them for not protecting her family, cursing Tyrion for escaping blame in death, and cursing Margaery for ever having come to King's Landing. Part of her wished to gather the last of her loyal guards and flee the city, but she knew Joffrey would never permit it. Nor did she have the boldness to abandon him outright. Below, in the tower, Margaery saw the orange glow of flames lighting the night sky. She heard the crash of distant explosions and the clang of steel. The city was under siege as never before. She clutched the bag of simple belongings she had stashed behind the bed. A spare shift, some bread she'd hidden away, and the jar of ointment from Varys. She had no idea if any of it would help, but it gave her a sense of readiness. She peered out her window, searching for any sign of the 3 candle flames. The night was moonless indeed, the clouds choking the sky. Darkness sprawled over the city, pierced by the flicker of torches and the sickly green glow of distant wildfire. Then, after hours of vigil, she spotted it. 3 small lights in a row, flickering from a tower across the courtyard. Her heart clenched. It was the signal. She stood, pulse racing, trying to calm her breathing. Minutes passed like hours. Then the door unlocked. 2 guards stepped in, and her stomach sank. Had they come to take her away as a hostage or as a scapegoat? But one guard removed his helm. Beneath was a narrow face and a pair of curious eyes. "Your Grace," he whispered. "This way, quickly." She recognized him as one of Varys's little birds, though older than a child. Perhaps the master of whisperers had scoured every corner for a trustworthy face. She followed him, carrying her meager bag, while the other guard brought up the rear. They hustled her down a spiral staircase, each footstep echoing ominously. She expected at any moment that Joffrey or some cluster of gold cloaks would appear. Yet the corridors were mostly deserted, each man called to defend the walls or to man a gate or simply to hide. They descended lower, to a servant's passage behind the kitchens, emerging in a dank hallway that reeked of old grease and rotted vegetables. From there, they passed a hidden door that led into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the Red Keep. Here, flickering torches revealed damp stone, webs, and the occasional rat scuttling across their path. The lead guard guided them through twisting corridors, each turn more confusing than the last. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a small chamber where Varys stood waiting, clad in plain garb. He greeted Marjorie with a nod and handed her a hooded cloak. "We must move quickly. The chaos above grows by the minute." She swallowed her gratitude, too uncertain to find words, and simply followed him deeper into the darkness. For Sansa Stark, that same night brought her own moment of flight. Varys's intermediaries arrived at her safe house, breathless, reporting that the city's walls had been breached in at least one spot. "If you remain here, there's a risk Stannis's men will sweep the district, and you might be found," one of them said. The old crone who ran the brothel nodded vigorously. Sansa gathered what few possessions she had, a threadbare cloak, a small pouch of silver coins, and followed them out through a back door. The narrow alley was slick with rain and ash. With each step, her heart hammered, expecting gold cloaks to round the corner or a wave of looters to descend. The city was in pandemonium. The sky glowed an infernal orange. You could hear the clash of arms, the screams, the crackle of fire. Fear settled in her bones, but she forced herself to keep moving. This was her chance to escape the city that had been her prison for so long. Some streets were crowded with people fleeing, but her guides knew quieter routes. They slipped between buildings and over low walls, heading toward the old Targaryen-era tunnels near the shoreline. Supposedly, one of them led outside the city's perimeter. Even if Stannis's men took the walls, the labyrinth might remain unnoticed for days. At a deserted square, they nearly collided with a troop of gold cloaks, but the soldiers were too preoccupied with their own predicament to give chase. A monstrous explosion somewhere near the Gate of the Gods shook the ground, sending stones tumbling from rooftops. Smoke billowed into the sky. Sansa covered her mouth, tears burning her eyes. How many innocents were dying in this madness? And would she count herself among them before the night was through? At last, they found the entrance to the tunnel, a broken grate behind a crumbling warehouse. The men with her pried it open, gesturing for Sansa to slip inside. The corridor beyond was pitch dark and reeked of stagnant water. Her stomach churned at the thought of crawling through, but she steeled herself, remembering that the alternative was captivity or worse. She ducked inside, hands fumbling over slick stone, and inched forward. Her escorts followed, pulling the grate back into place. On they went, guided by faint candlelight that danced eerily on the dripping walls. Sansa felt no sense of triumph yet. She was still in King's Landing, still in the realm of terror and flame. But with each step, she moved closer to freedom. In the Red Keep, Joffrey raged upon hearing that the walls had been compromised. He demanded that his Kingsguard form a phalanx and charge the breach. Tywin, meeting him halfway down a corridor, tried to reason with him. "We should consolidate our forces and protect the keep, Your Grace. If we lose the city, we can still hold the Red Keep until reinforcements arrive." Joffrey refused, spittle flying from his lips. "Cowards," he screeched. "You want to hide like rats while Stannis thinks he can take what's mine? I'll kill him myself if I must." Tywin saw the madness in the boy's eyes and realized that Joffrey might very well ride out and get himself killed. A small, treacherous part of Tywin wondered if that would not be the best outcome. But the Lord of Casterly Rock could not simply let the crown pass to chaos. "Your Grace, the men won't fight for you if you throw your life away," he said, measuring each word. "You must be cunning. Let us gather." Joffrey shoved past him, shouting for Ser Trant. "Bring my armor," he roared. "We'll crush them at the breach." Cersei appeared, frantic, clutching at his arm. "Joffrey, listen to your grandfather. If you ride out, you could be—" He rounded on her, eyes blazing. "Unhand me." He struck her aside, not as vicious a blow as he dealt others, but enough to send her staggering. Shock rippled through the hall. Cersei stared at him, tears of fury and disbelief gathering in her eyes. But she said nothing, only stood aside. Joffrey barked at Trant again. The Kingsguard knight, glancing at Tywin, hesitated. But a direct command from the king could not be disobeyed without immediate consequences. In short order, Joffrey was donning his ornate armor, the golden crown removed only to accommodate a helm. He marched out, calling for any who would ride with him. A ragged force of gold cloaks and knights, perhaps 100 strong, mustered in the courtyard. They looked uneasy, for to leave the safety of the Red Keep with an army at the gates was madness. But Joffrey gave them no choice. With a flourish, he led them out into the streets, determined to personally repel the invaders. Tywin watched from the steps, a sense of dread coiling in his gut. Cersei tried to meet his eyes, but he could not bring himself to look at her. Neither moved. Silence fell once the clatter of hoofbeats receded. They both wondered if that was the last they'd see of Joffrey. In the labyrinth of tunnels, Varys guided Margaery through passage after passage, occasionally pausing to listen. The thunder of battle above reverberated through the stone, a steady thrum of chaos. Eventually, they emerged into a large vaulted chamber that smelled of brine. An underground sluice connected here to the Blackwater Rush. In times past, it might have served as a secret exit for Targaryen royals. Now it was barely more than a half-flooded channel. A low barge waited there, manned by a hooded figure who nodded silently. Varys turned to Margaery. "This will carry you beyond the city walls, downriver. From there, you'll make your way to a friend I trust." Margaery could hardly believe she was so close to escaping. "Will you come with me?" she asked. Varys shook his head. "I have other matters to attend to. The realm is in tumult, and I must ensure it has some future. But we shall meet again, I hope, under better circumstances." She hesitated. "Thank you," she managed, voice tight, "for everything." Varys inclined his head. "May the gods keep you safe, Your Grace." He helped her onto the barge, and the hooded boatman pushed off. The current tugged them onward through the gloom. Margaery glanced back once, seeing only darkness. She felt a stab of fear. What if this was another trap? But as they slid along, she heard nothing but the drip of water and distant booms of the siege. Slowly, the channel opened, and they emerged into the broad river, the lights of King's Landing flickering behind them like a realm of nightmares. Farther away, she could glimpse the silhouette of tall-masted ships, sails slack in the wind. The boatman steered carefully to avoid detection, hugging the shoreline under the cover of night. High above, on the walls near the breach, the fighting intensified. Stannis's men had broken through some of the rubble, though pockets of gold cloaks still resisted. As Joffrey's small force arrived, confusion reigned. It was impossible to tell friend from foe in the smoke and darkness. Joffrey, clad in shining armor, bellowed for his men to charge. The clang of steel on steel rang out. Archers loosed arrows at close range, some hitting their own. Men screamed, stumbling over corpses in the flickering gloom. Joffrey spurred his horse forward, blind with rage, hacking at anyone in his path. Whether they were truly enemies or not, he could scarcely see. Green flames sputtered in the ruins, casting ghastly shadows. The boy king found himself face to face with a knight bearing the flaming heart of Stannis. Joffrey swung wildly, but the knight parried, nearly unhorsing him. Joffrey let out a snarl. "Die, traitor!" He shrieked, hacking again, but the knight was skilled. The clash went on for several blows before one of Joffrey's gold cloaks struck the knight from behind with a spear. The knight toppled, and Joffrey leaned in the saddle, panting. The stink of smoke and blood filled his nostrils. He urged his horse onward, deeper into the chaos. All around him, men fought and died without any sense of order. This was not the orchestrated fury of the Blackwater, nor the careful cunning of Tyrion's plan. It was a swirl of anarchy, made worse by the city's cramped streets and the half-collapsed wall. Above, archers from both sides continued to fire. A streak of flame illuminated the sky, followed by a thunderous crash in the distance. Some store of wildfire had exploded, or a catapult's shot had found its mark. In the flickering light, Joffrey saw a row of pikes bearing heads. His own men, some of them still wearing bits of Lannister livery. He gagged momentarily, the brutal reality of war unmasking his illusions of glory. But his fear mutated into rage. He spurred his horse toward the largest knot of combatants, screaming curses. A wave of defenders parted to let him pass, some in awe that the king was truly here, some simply too frightened to remain near him. Even in the midst of chaos, rumors traveled swiftly. Soon, men on both sides whispered that the boy king was on the field, his golden armor a beacon in the night. Some Stannis loyalists rallied to kill him. Others, unnerved, fell back. Joffrey did not notice the swirl of movement around him. His entire world was the clash of steel and the rush of blood in his ears. He had never truly experienced the horror of open battle. He had watched from safety at the Blackwater, had inflicted cruelty from the throne, but this was different. Here, men screamed in his face, the stench of excrement and gore saturating every breath. Everywhere he looked, he saw fear and hatred, and he realized dimly that the hatred was often directed at him. In a lull, he found himself near the base of the collapsed wall, his horse slick with sweat and lather. A group of gold cloaks had formed a shaky shield wall to block a wedge of Stannis' knights pressing forward. Joffrey forced his way to the front. He recognized none of the defenders personally. They were common men, ragged and fearful. "Hold the line," he commanded, brandishing his sword. The men glanced at one another. He saw doubt in their eyes. Their city was burning, their king was a mad tyrant, and now he demanded they sacrifice themselves again. A hush of indecision held them. Then the Stannis knights crashed against them, and the fight renewed. Joffrey lunged, slashing at the nearest knight. His blow glanced off a shield. An enemy sword cut the air near his face, missing by inches. Another blow hammered his chest plate, nearly knocking him from the saddle. He fumbled, dropping his reins. Then a gold cloak stepped in, parrying the next strike. Joffrey gasped, regaining his grip, and slashed the side of the knight's helm. A spurt of blood stained his sword. The knight sagged. Joffrey stared, chest heaving. A surge of triumph mingled with revulsion. This was real death, not the staged cruelty he so enjoyed. But even so, he felt an odd exhilaration. He had killed a traitor. He was unstoppable. He roared for the men to keep fighting. Elsewhere, other pockets of the city fell. Street by street, Stannis' troops advanced, carrying torches and improvised battering rams. The gold cloaks who did not flee or surrender were cut down. Cries of victory rang out among the invaders. Several tall buildings burned, casting an orange glow over the carnage. King's Landing was choking on smoke and blood. Some of the gold cloaks abandoned their posts or changed cloaks entirely, swapping loyalty for a chance to survive. Up in the Red Keep, Cersei and Tywin could do nothing but watch from the walls or listen to terrified reports. Tywin pressed a cool facade, but inside he knew this was likely the end. Their only hope might be to outlast the immediate assault behind the Red Keep's walls until the dawn, and pray Stannis' forces withdrew or grew disorganized. But Stannis had learned caution from his defeat at the Blackwater. He pressed relentlessly, determined not to let Joffrey slip away. His men advanced in disciplined columns, avoiding potential wildfire traps as best they could. The final outcome came near the city's main thoroughfare, where a wedge of well-armed knights cornered Joffrey's disorganized force. The gold cloaks, exhausted, saw fresh enemy banners streaming in from side streets. Fear took hold. One by one, they began to drop their shields, ignoring Joffrey's screams of "Stand and fight." Another explosion rocked the city. Stone fragments rained down. Horses reared. Men scattered. Joffrey tried to rally them, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Then the enemy knights charged. In the swirl, Joffrey felt a blow strike his backplate. He was hurled from the saddle, hitting the ground with a jarring thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. His sword clattered away. Flames flickered in his peripheral vision. He coughed, tasting blood. A shriek stuck in his throat. His helmet was dented, pressing painfully against his temples. He scrabbled at his chin strap, gasping. All around, men fought and died, ignoring him. His own gold cloaks had either been killed or routed. The battered remains of the force lay in heaps, and the victorious knights parted around him, searching for better targets. Dazed, Joffrey ripped off his helmet, dragging in harsh breaths of smoky air. A swirl of soot rained down. The city's sounds seemed distant, muffled by the roar in his ears. Pain lanced through his right side. A cracked rib, perhaps. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled. He cursed, tears streaming down his cheeks from the pain and the stinging smoke. He could not see well in the haze. Stumbling forward, he groped for any weapon. His hands found only corpses and shattered wood. At last, his fingers closed on a broken spear shaft, its tip jagged. He clutched it, face contorted with desperation. A shape loomed out of the darkness. A tall man in battered armor bearing Stannis's flaming heart. The visor lifted, revealing a sweaty face lined with grim purpose. The man froze for a moment, realizing he had stumbled upon the Boy King himself. A flicker of shock crossed his features, then a steeled resolve. Joffrey lifted the broken spear, brandishing it feebly. I am the king," he gasped, voice trembling. "You will kneel." The knight did not move. He studied Joffrey for a heartbeat, then shook his head. "King or no, you've brought naught but horror to this land." He raised his sword. Joffrey snarled, though it came out as a whimper. He lunged, but the knight easily batted the spear aside. The Boy King tumbled to his knees, fresh waves of pain roaring through him. "No," he spat. "I am Joffrey Baratheon. You can't." The knight's blade swung down in a clean arc. Joffrey felt a sudden impact, but no pain at first. His mouth opened, yet no sound came. Blood poured over his neck and chest. The knight wrenched his sword free, leaving Joffrey to slump forward. The Boy King's vision tunneled, the fires around him receding into a hazy blur. Vengeance and fear warred in his mind, but all he could do was choke on blood, the taste of iron flooding his mouth. In his final moments, he remembered the dais in the Great Hall, the throne that had once seemed untouchable. He had believed himself invincible, but here, in a shattered street, among the corpses and burning rubble of King's Landing, he died ignobly, a nobody's sword piercing his royal flesh. When news of Joffrey's death reached the Red Keep, the defenders realized the city was lost. Tywin, his features carved into stone, ordered the gates of the keep barred. What remained of the Lannister loyalists huddled behind those walls, unsure if Stannis would lay siege to the fortress or storm it outright. Cersei wept, not in the keening lament of a loving mother, but in furious, ragged sobs that shook her entire frame. Her son was dead, and all the sacrifices and atrocities had led to this. She cursed the Seven, cursed Marjorie, cursed the Tyrells, cursed Tyrion's memory, cursed the day Joffrey was ever born. In the corridors, servants crouched, waiting to see if the conquerors would breach the final seat of power. But by dawn, the city had fallen silent. Stannis's banners flew over the gates. The harbor was in his hands. Pockets of resistance in the streets were snuffed out. The Red Keep remained, but it was isolated. The leading knights of Stannis's host gathered to plan the next step. Some clamored for an immediate assault to end Tywin Lannister's hold once and for all. Others argued that a siege might be enough. Cut off the keep supply, starve them out. Stannis himself, grim and resolute, stood over a map of the city, hearing his lord's counsel. Davos Seaworth urged caution, reminding Stannis that too much bloodshed would only sow more hatred, and the city was already battered by war. Melisandre insisted that the usurper line must be purged fully, that the Lord of Light demanded no half measures. In the end, Stannis ordered them to surround the keep, ready for a final confrontation. Inside, Tywin Lannister considered one last gambit. He had perhaps 1,000 men still willing to fight, along with stores of wildfire. They could hold out for weeks if they were willing to see the city burn. But what end would that serve? If the city was lost, what was left to gain by dying in it? Kevan advised seeking terms, but Tywin's pride rebelled. He had never bent the knee to Stannis or any other pretender. Yet the realm could not be ruled from a grave. Reluctantly, Tywin drafted a message offering to surrender the Red Keep in exchange for safe passage for those within. Whether Stannis would honor such terms was uncertain. By midday, a herald of Stannis stood outside the keep's gates, reading a royal decree that named Stannis Baratheon the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms by the grace of the gods. He demanded Tywin Lannister's unconditional surrender and the release of any prisoners. Cersei, half-crazed with grief, raged at the idea of surrender. She threatened to throw herself from the battlements if Tywin so much as wrote a reply. But Tywin, colder than the winter wind, instructed a scribe to pen a response, stating that he would consider negotiations. Then, in a quieter aside, he told Kevan that if Stannis refused to show them leniency, they would unleash their last reserves of wildfire and perish in an inferno that would consume them all. That night, King's Landing was still ablaze in places, but the storms had abated. Bodies littered the streets. Looting and violence persisted, though Stannis's men were under orders to preserve order as best they could. A wave of refugees tried to leave the city, but found that the gates were closely watched by the new regime. Meanwhile, hidden in the outskirts or along the banks of the Blackwater, those who had fled earlier waited anxiously to see what shape the new world would take. Somewhere downriver, Marjorie Tyrell drifted away from the city, uncertain of what fate awaited her. In a different direction, Sansa Stark crawled through a stinking tunnel that eventually opened to the wooded slopes south of King's Landing. She emerged into clean air, blinking at the starlight, tears slipping down her cheeks as she realized she was truly free, for the moment at least. Both women had survived, though at unspeakable cost. At dawn, Tywin and Kevan stood at the gates of the Red Keep, accompanied by a retinue of red-cloaked Lannister guards. Outside waited Stannis Baratheon, wearing dark armor embellished with the red heart of R'hllor. He was flanked by Melisandre, her ruby glinting, and by a ring of grim-faced knights. Davos Seaworth hovered to one side, expression guarded. Between them stretched a blood-stained courtyard, the final threshold. In a voice that carried across the hush, Tywin announced he would negotiate the keep's surrender. Stannis inclined his head curtly, stepping forward to meet him. The tension felt suffocating. Each side expected betrayal. Every soldier's hand hovered near a sword hilt. Stannis declared that Tywin Lannister would be allowed safe passage to Casterly Rock with his immediate family. But all crown property and the Red Keep itself belonged now to the rightful king. Any gold cloak or knight wishing clemency would have to swear an oath to Stannis. Cersei would be placed under protective guard until her complicity in Joffrey's crimes could be adjudicated. Tywin's face revealed nothing, but inside, fury churned. He could hardly believe he was bowing to Stannis. Yet the alternative was a hopeless battle that would see all of them burned alive. He lowered his head in stiff acceptance. Thus ended the reign of King Joffrey Baratheon, not in a grand final stand, but in blood and chaos that left the capital in ruins. In the days that followed, Stannis moved into the Red Keep. His men systematically searched for caches of wildfire, disarming them before a stray spark could ignite half the city. Tywin and Kevan left the city under armed escort, heading west with a small retinue. Cersei, robbed of her power, spent her days under guard in the same tower that had once held Marjorie. She did not know or care what had become of her father or the rest of her family. She only knew that her children were gone, and all her schemes had collapsed. Stannis proclaimed himself king, dispatching raven after raven to the great houses of Westeros. Many lords, weary of Joffrey's tyranny, voiced support, at least conditionally. Some, like the Tyrell bannermen, demanded that Marjorie Tyrell be freed and compensated for her suffering. When Stannis's men scoured the Red Keep, they found no trace of her. Word soon reached them that she had escaped in the chaos, possibly escorted by Varys's agents. As for Varys himself, he vanished once again, leaving behind only rumors. Some said he had fled to Pentos, others that he hid in the city still, pulling strings from the shadows. King's Landing began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. The charred remains of structures had to be cleared, bodies buried, diseases prevented from spreading. Stannis ruled with a stern sense of justice, harsh, but not wantonly cruel. He hanged gold cloaks who had committed atrocities or deserted their posts in favor of plunder. He rewarded those who had fought bravely, albeit with reluctant praise. Many small folk found themselves uncertain whether the new king would treat them any better, but at least he did not seem to take pleasure in their suffering. He ordered bread distribution from the granaries, though supplies were meager. The city was battered, but it was alive, no longer under the lash of Joffrey's madness. Across Westeros, the word spread: Joffrey Baratheon was dead. Some heard it with relief, some with terror, unsure what new war might follow. In Highgarden, the news of Marjorie's escape from captivity brought a glimmer of hope, and the Tyrell bannermen, newly emboldened, began negotiating with Stannis's envoys. In the north, ravens flew with the same warning. The dead marched, but no one had yet realized the scope of the threat. Winter was not just coming. It was already there, creeping past the wall. For many months to come, songs would be sung of the fall of King's Landing and the tyrant boy king who died in the streets. Most small folk cared little for the details of which noble house sat upon the throne, so long as the harvest was good and the roads were safe. Yet bards whispered that Joffrey's cruelty had nearly torn the realm apart, that his gruesome death was no more than he deserved. Others, more cautious, avoided proclaiming such sentiments openly, lest the new regime take offense. Still, the tales persisted. How a rose was nearly strangled by a lion, how the city burned in a night of horror, how the dwarf who once tried to save the realm died by his nephew's decree, how the old lion withdrew in shame, and how the old alliances had crumbled. Far away, Sansa Stark journeyed the Riverlands, aided by those who pitted her house or who despised the Lannisters. She kept her identity hidden whenever possible, though her red hair often drew attention. She learned to be cautious, to use false names. At night, she sometimes dreamed of Tyrion, of her family, of Winterfell, wondering if any place was truly safe. At least Joffrey was gone, a monstrous footnote in the history of her long torment. She prayed her sister Arya was still alive somewhere, prayed that maybe one day they would see each other again. For now, survival was enough of a goal, step by step, day by day. Marjorie Tyrell found herself on a small vessel bound for the Reach, accompanied by one of Varys's trusted agents. She traveled incognito, wearing modest clothing and a hood to conceal her features. Whenever the ship stopped at a port, she stayed below decks, uncertain whom to trust. At last, they reached a secluded cove near Highgarden's domains, where sympathetic soldiers recognized her by a token ring she carried. Over the course of weeks, she regained her health and learned how Stannis had sacked King's Landing, how Joffrey had died. She felt a fierce, unexpected mixture of relief and sorrow. None of it could bring back Olenna or undo the horrors that had been wrought. She wept for the grandmother who had tried to save her from a monster. She prayed that in some way the Tyrell line might rebuild. But she also understood that, once again, she was a piece on the chessboard of Westeros, valuable to whichever power sought to claim the Iron Throne. And with Stannis ascendant, new alliances would form, new bargains would be struck. She resolved to ensure that no one would ever again use her as a pawn so easily. She would be a rose with hidden thorns, prepared to do whatever necessary to protect the people she loved. In the end, the story of King Joffrey's unchecked reign became a lesson in the perils of letting cruelty go unchallenged. Olenna Tyrell had once held the chance to end his life quietly at the Purple Wedding, but fear and caution stayed her hand. The realm paid the price. A descent into tyranny, bloodshed, and civil war on a scale that dwarfed even the War of the Five Kings. Though Joffrey's life ended violently in the streets he once thought he owned, the scars he left on Westeros would remain for years, perhaps generations. The small folk still recalled the screaming nights of wildfire, the heads on spikes outside the Red Keep, the endless spiral of brutality that had taken root when a cruel child was given absolute power. In time, historians would debate how it might have been different had Joffrey's madness been halted earlier. Some would claim the entire conflict could have been averted, that fewer lives would have been lost, that alliances might have held strong against the true threats to the realm. Others would argue that Westeros was always fated to burn, that the seeds of war were sown the moment Robert's rebellion ended with the Targaryen downfall. Yet for those who lived through it, the truth remained plain. A single moment of inaction, one pinch of poison withheld, had led to the crowning of a tyrant and a conflagration that nearly destroyed King's Landing. As winter advanced, the realm shifted under new powers. Stannis Baratheon sat the Iron Throne in a city still smoking from the fires of war, contending with unrest, famine, and the gathering cold. In the distant east, Daenerys Targaryen continued her campaign of liberation, still far from Westeros but inching closer to the day she might look west again. In the north, the shadows of the White Walkers grew longer, though few truly understood the magnitude of that threat. And across the Seven Kingdoms, survivors picked up the pieces. Lords and ladies forged uneasy alliances, war-weary knights tended their wounds, peasants rebuilt their burned homes, and in hushed corners, people told stories of the Boy King's cruelty, recalling the countless tragedies he had wrought. Highgarden mourned the Queen of Thorns, who had once been their indomitable matriarch, while Marjorie Tyrell quietly rose to become the new face of her house. The Lannisters, though battered, remained wealthy and formidable in their western strongholds, forced to reckon with the fact that their greatest gambit had cost them 2 heirs and nearly all their influence at court. Cersei was left a prisoner of her own ruin, and Tywin faced the bitter knowledge that his legacies had slipped through his grasp. The other regions watched and waited. Would Stannis prove a more just king, or would he fall into the same cycle of bloodshed and rivalry? In the quiet villages far from the capital, minstrels composed ballads of the dark reign just past. They sang of a rose captive in a tower, of a lion with no heart, of a thrice-accursed seat made of swords that brought misery to whoever ruled from it. In markets and inns, folks told one another, "Perhaps a kinder hand will hold the realm now," or "At least we're free of that demon child," or "The next king can't be worse, can he?" Yet each remark held an undertone of dread. They had seen how fragile peace could be. They had lived through a king who took pleasure in torment and wore a crown of cruelty as though it were his birthright. The scars would not fade quickly, if they ever faded at all. So ended the reign of King Joffrey Baratheon, in ashes and screams, in terror and ruin, all because no one dared end it at the wedding feast. The realm stumbled onward. Winter deepened. The dragons across the sea grew larger, their mother's ambition growing alongside them. The walkers in the far north stirred, unmoved by mortal politics. And the living, battered and bruised, clung to whatever flickers of hope they could find in the long night that stretched ahead.